Hello and welcome to Storytime episode 16, which is chapter 12 of The Blood King. If you have not listened to the previous chapters of The Blood King, I recommend you jump on back to The Blood King prologue, which is Storytime episode 4, and catch up from there. Without further ado, here's chapter 12. Chapter 12. Janice was anything but put together in the 12 hours following the discovery of her ancestry. She couldn't sleep, and ended up tossing and turning like a chicken on a rotisserie the entire night. When she dragged herself out of bed the next morning, she'd only half managed to convince herself that it was all a dream. It wasn't exactly easy to come to terms with, but a witch of all things? Janice had spent hours, days, months going over every record she ever found on Blue Valley and its origins, its myths and legends and strange stories that just didn't quite add up. Everyone else had thought she was crazy. There had always been this feeling, though, one that Janice couldn't seem to squash down no matter how many times her father had begged her to see things rationally. Witches aren't real, Janice, her father had snapped at her more than once. And every time there was a little voice in the back of Janice's mind, one she could never ignore. But there are. Really, Janice, you need to be more logical. Why on earth would a bunch of ancient witches settle here of all places? It's the most boring and quiet town in the world, her father had reminded her time and again. But is boring and quiet not the best place for a coven who never wanted to be exposed? Janice's reasoning had been pushed aside and ignored on more than one occasion, the main reason why Janice and her father had never really gotten along. Her mother had died when she was young. Janice barely remembered her now. She knew her smile, but could never picture the rest of her face. She knew her scent, even though her father had tried his best over the years to drown it in cigarette smoke. When Janice turned 18 a little over a year ago, she'd had enough. She'd spent as much time as she could away from the apartment she'd always called home, until the day she went back home for a change of clothes and found her father's room empty. He hadn't even left her a note, but Janice knew he wasn't coming back. At times she didn't even know why she'd cried at the loss. The only logical conclusion she could ever come to was that he was her father, and despite all his faults and bad parenting, he would always remain so. Still, Janice never attempted to contact him. She'd graduated, then got a job at the library that kept her busy and quiet. She'd interacted with old friends when necessary, but most of them had done their best to leave this little town. The one thing she couldn't seem to stop doing, though, no matter how hard she tried, was cleaning. Every floorboard, cupboard, dish and glass was always sparkling in Janice's apartment. Despite the fact no one had smoked in the apartment for well over a year, Janice still smelt it. It clung to the walls and the carpets and the furniture. Janice had tried to mask it as best she could with different air fresheners and flowers and whatever else she could find, but the smoke was always there. Janice couldn't help but wonder that morning after speaking with the Frey siblings if the smoke was her doing. Was the smoke magic? Could she banish it? But Janice didn't know how magic worked, and thought it better not to let her imagination run too wild. The thoughts didn't stop, though. Was magic visible, or did it only affect its intended target? Kelsey had mentioned both empathic and elemental witches. What was really the difference? If they could grow up in the same covens, how come Kelsey had spoken as if they were taught different ways? Was it something to do with where they drew energy from? Kelsey had mentioned something about celestial magic as well. Did that mean there were celestial witches? If Janice did magic, would she have to pay a price? That's what it talked about sometimes in movies. The price paid was usually something to do with physical appearance, but Kelsey looked fine. Then again, she was an empathic witch, and Janice was apparently elemental, whatever that meant. Janice groaned, rubbing her tired eyes. This was getting her nowhere. She needed more questions answered. The problem was, she didn't think the Freys were the best choice. They were one side of the coin, but what about the other coven in town, the Capricorn? Kelsey had made them out as evil incarnate, but if what Janice had read in the town histories were true, the Freys weren't exactly saints either. Besides that, Janice was reluctant to trust vampires. She looked out from her balcony and over the town square. Now that she'd insisted on being introduced to this world, exactly what had she expected? That answers would fall into her lap and then she'd be fine and happy to live the rest of her life as she saw fit. She'd been rash and couldn't help being angry at Kelsey for dragging her in. The coven had let her be. Why hadn't she? So deep in thought, Janice didn't notice the black cat approach until it sat on the poor excuse of an outdoor table right next to her arm. She jumped up in surprise and turned to put her empty cup down, then frowned at it. "Haven't seen you around here before," Janice admitted. "What are you doing here?" The cat tilted its head, then to Janice's shock, it spoke back. "Amusing myself." Janice jumped again, then looked at the cat more closely, watching as its fur seemed to flicker between shades of black and transparent in the light. "Lunara?" asked Janice. "That would be me," the cat replied. "You should really stop being surprised, though I suppose it's a first for me too." "What's a first?" asked Janice. "Talking to somebody other than Calcinia," Lunara admitted. "I usually do my best to just be a cat. It's not been a bad life for the last 300 years or so." Janice shook her head, turning away. Then she snatched up her mug and walked inside. "Walking away isn't going to solve your problems," Lunara said, licking one of his paws. Janice paused, turning back to the cat. "Leave me alone." "Regardless of what you may think, I find you interesting. I'll be out here when you decide you're ready. Your apartment smells funny." Janice frowned, turning back to face the cat. "Funny how?" Lunara shrugged his little cat shoulders, a weird look on a cat. His tail flicked lazily back and forth. "I'm bonded to an empathic witch, so I tend to sense certain things." "Like what?" asked Janice. "Like emotions." "No shit. Why would that make you say that my apartment smells funny? I mean, I am going through a bit of an identity crisis right now, but why would that affect where I live?" asked Janice. "Emotions aren't just felt. Sometimes, if they are strong enough, they also affect, imbue," Lunara explained. "They leave traces of what came before." Janice paused for a moment, taking in what the cat had said, then spoke again. "Does it smell like smoke?" Lunara turned his head to the side again. "Strange. Didn't think you could smell it too." "Why smoke?" asked Janice. "It would be something to do with the emotions felt whilst the smoke was being produced. It took on the qualities of the smoke as its reminder," Lunara replied. Janice turned away. It was a question she'd never thought she'd have answered, but now that she had an answer, she wasn't sure it reassured her anyway. Janice went to walk back inside when Lunara spoke again. "You could ask Kelsey to get rid of it," Lunara said. "Couldn't she just tell me how to get rid of it?" asked Janice, reluctant to have to owe the witch a favour. "You're untrained and elemental," Lunara stated, as if that was explanation enough. "Isn't it the same spell?" asked Janice. Lunara stood, making a little jump to the balcony rail. "There are some things elemental witches can't do, whilst empathic witches can, and vice versa." "And this is something I can't do?" asked Janice. Lunara didn't reply, just jumped off the railing and seemed to vanish mid-air. Janice sighed. That cat has really bad timing. Turning back into her apartment and closing the door behind her, Janice couldn't help leaning against it as the smoky smell invaded her nostrils again. She needed it gone. Looked like Calcinia Frey would be answering more questions after all. Kelsey and Dimitri weren't at the manor when Janice showed up. It was then that Janice remembered they were pretending to be students. Having lived over 400 years, Janice could imagine how degrading it must be for them to keep up appearances. Pausing just outside the door, Janice heard the sound of metal on metal and rounded the house to come to a large garage around the side of the house. It looked like it could house at least 20 vehicles, but at the moment it only held 4 cars and 6 motorcycles, one of which was being worked on by the eldest Frey sibling. Lawrence Frey had seemed different the night before, like he was calmer than his brother and sister, perhaps more mature. Still, Janice doubted that would make much of a difference if the vampire decided Janice was worth lunch. She certainly had no ability to fight him off. Turning back to walk to her car, she paused when she heard the vampire behind her. "I don't bite," he said, not even glancing her way before he added, "Not often, anyway." It must have been how cliché the line sounded that made Janice smile for what felt like the first time in a long time. In reality, it had only been last night, right when she walked into Carpathy Manor for the history lessons she had thirsted for. She'd certainly got more than she bargained for. Janice turned back around, her smile fading. Come in peace?" Janice hesitated. Lawrence smirked, giving a side glance towards her, his strange brown and gold eyes looking at her with nothing more than amusement. "I'm not an alien," he replied. "You aren't human," Janice countered. "No, haven't been for a long time," Lawrence stated. "So witches are human?" asked Janice. "Witches are humans with magic in their blood, nothing more, nothing less," Lawrence replied. "Why, were you wondering if you'd grow horns and warts, possibly a tail to finish off the ensemble?" "Not the tail," Janice admitted. "Well, as far as I'm aware, you won't have horns either, and warts seem unlikely for you," Lawrence stated. "What are you, 19? Janice nodded, then remembered he wasn't actually looking at her. "Yep." "You can come over here. I promise you can leave the property with the exact same amount of blood you arrived with," Lawrence said, standing and moving around the bike. "What are you doing?" asked Janice, trying to get her mind off the fact she was conversing with a blood-sucking monster. "Maintenance on the bikes. A lot of them haven't been ridden in a good 4 decades, said Lawrence. Now that Janice had a closer look, she did realise that most of the bikes looked like old models, like you wouldn't catch anyone riding them anymore old. "You ride these?" asked Janice. "I prefer the cars, but Dimitri isn't much for mechanics," Lawrence replied. "Can't he fix them?" asked Janice. "He could, but he knows I think it's therapeutic. It's a chore for him," Lawrence smiled. "He didn't seem like a hard worker when I met him earlier," Janice observed. "He works hard when he wants something," Lawrence replied, "like alcohol, the thrill of a fight." "Blood?" Janice hadn't meant to have input, but nevertheless she had spoken out loud. Lawrence paused and turned fully to face Janice. "If you're uncomfortable, you can leave." "Sorry, I didn't mean to offend you," Janice replied. Lawrence smiled. This time it seemed warm, truly caring. "Just be thankful you said it to me and not my brother. He would have made a cruel joke about it." He turned back to his work, falling into silence again. "How did you find out you were a witch?" asked Janice. "My mother was one. That's usually a pretty good indication that you'll inherit the magic as its dominant," Lawrence replied. "I don't remember it, but I was always told stories of how ecstatic the coven was. They revelled for weeks after my birth. Everyone wanted to babysit for my mother." "It sounds much better than I thought," Janice replied. "The first time I remember one of them trying to teach me magic, she asphyxiated me," Lawrence stated. Janice's eyes widened in shock, her hands flying to her neck. "She choked you?" "No, she stole the air from my lungs. It's the first element a witch is supposed to learn, but I hadn't started attempting to practice yet. The coven had grown impatient, and when my mother had left on one of her many missions, the coven had tried to force lessons on me," Lawrence said. He didn't seem angry or sad or even scared. He spoke as if he was just telling another story. "What happened?" asked Janice. "I showed her exactly how to asphyxiate someone," Lawrence replied, "though not intentionally. My magic had lashed out to save me, and I nearly killed her. The coven was more cautious after that. It was then they realised just how powerful I was." "There are different degrees of power?" asked Janice. Lawrence nodded. "Usually purer bloodlines tend to produce more powerful witches, but no empathic witch had ever had an elemental son before. They didn't realise how powerful my blood was until me. When Dimitri was born, they were far more cautious with him, almost afraid of what he would do. Besides, I was always around him, so even if they tried to awaken him the same way they had me, I would have protected him. Regardless, when my mother found out, she took us from the elemental elders, trained us how she saw fit. She was far kinder and far more patient." "I'm sorry," Janice said. Lawrence smiled. "It's not your fault. Be glad you were not forced into the same training." "They still train that way?" asked Janice. "It is the fastest way to have magic manifest," Lawrence stated. "Personally, I believe empathic witches are far more suited to teaching. Their ability to detect and control emotions allows them to know exactly where the limit of an individual is." "So, if I want to awaken, I should ask Kelsey to help me?" asked Janice. Lawrence sighed. "It would be a better option than the Coven, but that is up to you to decide. If you continue to go unnoticed and unattended, your magic will remain under wraps unless your life is threatened. Things like familiars would be hard to avoid seeing, though. They're pretty noticeable. I don't know what... We weren't forcing you into this world. You asked," said Lawrence. "Had you insisted on forgetting, Kelsey could help you forget. She still could. But the danger with that is that maybe no one will be around to help or explain next time. And being unable to protect yourself, that could end badly for both you and anyone else involved." "She can make me forget?" asked Janice. Lawrence nodded. "Pretty simple spell, really. And without it, we would have been exposed to the human world quite some time ago." "You say that as if you live on an entirely different planet," said Janice. "To many it seems that way," Lawrence replied. "How strange it is to step from a world of blood and magic and loose morals into a world where such things are taboo." Janice supposed it was strange. "Is it a law that it must be kept hidden?" "In a way," Lawrence replied. "We used to have a governing body, but not really anymore. At the moment, every race governs themselves, but they all tend to stick to the rule about keeping magic separate from the humans." "Why don't you have a governing body anymore?" asked Janice. "It was around the time the Fae came to our world, around about 1,000 years ago. Many protested to their magic as it was different, born of another world. They believed it to be darker and far more powerful. The Guardians, as the governing body was known, made a deal with the Fae courts, that their magic was not to interfere with the balance of our world and that they would be limited in how many and for how long they could stay in this world before they must return to their own. Many races from this world protested that they wanted the Fae gone entirely. But with the deal made, the Guardians just seemed to disappear," Lawrence explained. "The Fae?" asked Janice. "Fairies are real." Lawrence chuckled. "A lot of things are real. Lichens, elementals, hell, even gods." "Gods? Plural?" asked Janice. "Many gods for many things. Most of them are either dead or keep to themselves in a secluded corner of the world. They know not to interfere anymore. The humans are too inquisitive, too aware," Lawrence replied. Janice tried to wrap her head around all that, then sighed. She needed to pull back. "Which do you prefer, being a vampire or a witch?" Lawrence gave a side look at Janice. "There's only one other person that's asked me that before." "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to offend. Stop apologising. It means more in my world than it does in yours," Lawrence stated. He'd frowned, but he didn't seem angry. It was obvious, however, that he wouldn't answer Janice's question. They were silent for a while before Janice spoke. I don't know how to make sense of this world. The world, or worlds apparently, is suddenly too big for me to comprehend." "I can imagine," said Lawrence. "Humans are pretty ignorant of what's around them." "Not sure if that's an insult or not," Janice mumbled. "You were looking into the history of the town and making assumptions that were pretty close to the truth," said Lawrence. "That's a witch's intuition, not a human's." "That was my imagination running wild," Janice corrected. "Believe what you want," stated Lawrence, tightening a bolt on a part of the contraption Janice would not have been able to identify if she tried. "But now that you know you have this gift, what do you intend to do with it? Because if you're just going to ignore it, how are you going to protect what you love when the time comes? We found out what you are. It's only a matter of time before Capricorn does as well, if they haven't already." "What will they do to me?" asked Janice. "If they don't know about you already, probably recruit you," said Lawrence. "Train you to be a pawn in their game like they tried to do for my siblings and I. They could also kill you or make your life miserable. Depends on how much they think you're attached to our family. If they don't know and they find out now, they'll either ignore you as you don't currently pose a threat untrained, or they'll kill you through association with us." "Good to know," stated Janice. All the more reason to learn who you are, in my opinion, replied Lawrence. But hey, what do I know? I'm only a vampire. Janice stopped and nodded to herself. You and Kelsey are both good at this. Good at what? Asked Lawrence. Saying the right thing, Janice replied. A brutally honest thing, but the right thing. Lawrence smiled warmly. 400 years of experience would make anyone a master of words. Though I don't endeavour to show it. You're in need, so I told you what you needed to hear. I don't really know who to trust. I've only heard one side of this war, said Janice. Lawrence smiled. I don't recommend making Capricorn aware of your plight, but it is your choice. If you decide to come to my sister, she'll be happy to help. Can I stay here a while? To think, said Janice as she walked backwards towards the main house. Any time, replied Lawrence. Janice couldn't help but smile at him as she turned back to face the front driveway. Sighing to herself, she mentally prepared for what she would have to ask Kelsey to do that night. She wasn't sure if the witch would ask for a favour in return, or if she'd just help of her own volition. Though, if anything, Janice couldn't ask Lawrence. He loved his siblings far too much. Checking each individual crossbow bolt with a keen and expert eye, Carmen the Huntress looked pleased with the weaponry she'd assembled. The Frey brothers had presented her with an opportunity. Their home was secluded and away from prying eyes, no doubt the perfect place to attack without repercussions from the human authorities. Just one more day and the Huntress could go home. She'd never wanted this life, but it had been thrust upon her all the same. Hours of training had turned into years, and before she knew it, she'd been an assassin, only one meant for things that were more than just human. She knew there were others like her out in the world somewhere. Her mistress called them the Hunters Association, but Carmen had never felt compelled to find them. If anything, she'd just wanted a normal life, away from the blood and power-hungry souls of the world she'd been brought up in. But it was not to be. Packing away her things, the Huntress left payment for the room on the bed, then opened the door and left into the night. She wouldn't be here much longer anyway. Despite what the old vampire had said about the empathic witch, the Huntress wasn't deterred. She'd been up against plenty of witches in her lifetime. Just because this one threw on emotions didn't mean she stood a chance. By tomorrow morning, the Frey brothers would be dead, possibly the empath too if she got in the way. The Huntress couldn't bring herself to care much for those she was trained to kill. Well, that was chapter 12 of The Blood King. Thank you for joining me. Let me know what you thought down below. And I'll see you next time. Stay happy and healthy. Bye.